The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Rebecca Wilson adjusted her black robe and took a deep breath before entering. Today marked her 5th year on the bench in the downtown courthouse, and she had earned a reputation for being fair but firm. Her colleagues respected her sharp mind and ability to see through deception, while lawyers knew better than to come unprepared to her courtroom. At 42, Rebecca had built the life she'd always dreamed of. Her journey hadn't been easy, growing up in a small town with limited opportunities, working her way through law school, climbing the ranks as a prosecutor, and finally, earning her place on the bench. Her personal life, however, remained a carefully guarded secret. Few knew about the heartbreak that had shaped her early years, a pain she had buried beneath layers of professional accomplishment. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Rebecca entered the courtroom. She nodded to the room and took her seat, scanning the day's docket. It was Monday, arraignment day, which meant a steady stream of defendants would appear before her for their initial hearings. Most cases were routine: drug possession, petty theft, assault, but Rebecca never allowed herself to become complacent. Behind each case number was a human being, and she never forgot the weight of her responsibility. "First case on the docket," the clerk announced. "State vs. Thomas Reynolds." Rebecca froze. The name echoed in her mind, stirring memories she had locked away for over 20 years. It couldn't be the same Thomas. That would be too strange, too cruel a coincidence. She composed herself quickly, maintaining the professional demeanor that had become second nature. "Bring in the defendant," she instructed, her voice betraying nothing of her inner turmoil. The side door opened, and a man in an orange jumpsuit was led in by 2 officers. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she forced herself to look at his face. The years had changed him. His once jet-black hair was now peppered with gray, lines etched around his eyes, his shoulders slightly stooped, but there was no mistaking those piercing blue eyes. The same eyes that had once looked at her with such love and promise. Thomas Reynolds. Her first love. Her greatest heartbreak. Rebecca gripped the edge of her desk, grateful that no one could see her white knuckles behind the raised bench. 23 years had passed since that summer after high school graduation when they had promised each other forever. Before college and distance pulled them apart. Before misunderstandings and pride kept them from finding their way back to each other. Thomas hadn't noticed her yet. He kept his eyes downcast, a posture of defeat that seemed so at odds with the confident boy she once knew. The boy who had taught her to swim in the lake outside town, who had held her hand at her father's funeral, who had helped her believe in herself when no one else did. "Mr. Reynolds, you are charged with fraud and embezzlement," the prosecutor began, reading from a file. "The state alleges that you misappropriated funds from your employer, Westland Construction, in the amount of $300,000 over a period of 2 years. Rebecca watched Thomas's face, searching for any sign of the person she once knew. He looked older than his 43 years, worn down by life in ways she couldn't begin to understand. What had happened to him? How had the boy who once talked about becoming an architect ended up here, in her courtroom, accused of stealing? "How do you plead?" she asked, her judicial training taking over when her mind threatened to wander. Thomas finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when recognition flickered across his face. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parted in surprise. Then, just as quickly, he recovered, schooling his features into a neutral expression. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he replied, his voice deeper than she remembered but still achingly familiar. Rebecca nodded, continuing with the procedural questions while her mind raced. He had recognized her too. What was he thinking? Did he know she had become a judge? Was he embarrassed to be standing before her like this? The questions swirled through her mind, but she maintained her professional facade. As the hearing proceeded, Rebecca learned the basic facts of the case. Thomas had been the financial controller at Westland Construction for 8 years. The company accused him of creating false vendors and diverting payments to his personal accounts. If convicted, he faced up to 15 years in prison. His court-appointed attorney requested reasonable bail, citing Thomas's ties to the community and lack of prior criminal record. The prosecutor argued for a high bail amount, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges and the potential financial motivation to flee. Throughout the exchange, Rebecca listened with the impartiality her position demanded, all while fighting an internal battle between past and present. Every fiber of her being wanted to recuse herself from this case. Ethically, she knew she should. But doing so would require an explanation, would mean revealing a personal connection she wasn't prepared to acknowledge publicly. Bail is set at $100,000, she finally ruled, splitting the difference between what each side had requested. Next appearance is scheduled for 3 weeks from today for the preliminary hearing. As Thomas was led away, he glanced back at her. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Rebecca saw a flicker of the boy she had once loved, earnest, kind, with a quiet strength that had drawn her to him all those years ago. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud that seemed to echo her own heartbeat. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Rebecca handled each case with her usual efficiency, but her mind kept returning to Thomas. By lunchtime, she retreated to her chambers and closed the door, finally allowing herself to process what had happened. She sank into her chair and closed her eyes, memories washing over her like waves. Their first date at the old drive-in theater. Stargazing on the hood of his father's truck. The way he'd helped her fill out college applications when she'd nearly given up on herself. The promise ring he'd given her the night before she left for university, a simple silver band she'd kept in a box at the back of her drawer all these years. What had brought him to this point? The Thomas she knew had been honest to a fault, with dreams as big as the sky. Had she ever really known him? Or had the years changed him into someone she couldn't recognize? More importantly, what was she going to do now? Rebecca sat alone in her office long after the courthouse had emptied. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her as she stared at the case file open on her desk. Thomas Reynolds. The name that had once been written in the margins of her notebooks, now typed in cold, official font on criminal documents. She knew what she had to do. First thing tomorrow, she would file paperwork to recuse herself from the case. It was the right thing, the only thing she could do ethically. Yet something held her back from making the decision final tonight. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, a desire to understand how the boy with so much promise had ended up facing serious criminal charges. Against her better judgment, Rebecca began reading through the case materials. The prosecution painted Thomas as calculating and deceptive, systematically stealing from his employer over years. But as she read his employment history and character statements from colleagues, contradictions emerged. He had been promoted twice, praised for his dedication. He had organized fundraisers for co-workers facing medical crises. This didn't sound like someone who had planned to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. When her phone rang, Rebecca jumped. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Judge Wilson, she answered, trying to sound like she hadn't been lost in the past for hours. Rebecca, it's Alan, said her colleague, Judge Peterson. We missed you at dinner. Everything okay? Just catching up on some paperwork, she replied. Sorry I couldn't make it. No problem. Hey, I heard Reynolds came through your courtroom today. Nasty case. Rebecca's breath caught. You know something about it? Not officially, but my brother-in-law works at Westland. Word is, Reynolds has been taking the fall for something bigger. Just thought you should know there might be more to the story. After hanging up, Rebecca sat back, mind racing. What had Alan meant? Taking the fall? For whom? She shouldn't be thinking about this, she needed to recuse herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas might be in trouble deeper than she understood. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She needed to file her recusal before the day's proceedings began. But as she walked toward her office, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench in the hallway, a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Rebecca called before she could stop herself. Thomas's mother looked up, her weathered face showing surprise, then recognition. "Rebecca? Rebecca Wilson? Oh my goodness, it's been years." They embraced awkwardly, the circumstances hanging heavy between them. "I heard you became a judge," Mrs. Reynolds said with genuine pride. "Thomas told me he saw you yesterday. What a shock for both of you, I imagine." Rebecca nodded, unsure how to navigate this conversation. "Mrs. Reynolds, I shouldn't be discussing." I know," the older woman interrupted. "I'm not here to talk about the case. Her voice broke. "I needed to see the place where my son's fate will be decided. I don't understand any of this. Thomas has always been honest, sometimes to his own detriment." Rebecca felt a lump forming in her throat. "I can't be involved in his case. I'm filing for recusal this morning." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, understanding. "Of course. But before you go, there's something you should know. Thomas has been different these past few months, anxious, withdrawn. When I asked what was wrong, he just said he was trying to protect someone. I thought maybe he was in some kind of relationship trouble, but now I wonder." Rebecca's judicial instincts kicked in. "Mrs. Reynolds, has Thomas said anything specific about the charges against him?" "No, he won't discuss it with me. Just keeps saying he'll handle it. But I know my son. He's not a thief." As they parted ways, Rebecca felt the weight of the encounter settle on her shoulders. She continued to her office and completed the recusal paperwork, citing a personal connection that could create a perceived conflict of interest. She didn't specify the nature of the connection, and thankfully, no one asked. With the paperwork filed, Rebecca should have felt relieved. The case would be assigned to another judge, and her connection to Thomas would remain private. But instead of relief, she felt a growing unease. What if Thomas was innocent? What if he was protecting someone, as his mother suggested? The thought followed her throughout the day as she presided over other cases, maintaining her professional demeanor while her mind kept returning to Thomas, to the past, and to the mystery surrounding his current situation. That evening, as Rebecca was leaving the courthouse, her clerk hurried after her. "Judge Wilson. You got a message while you were in court." He handed her a folded note. Rebecca opened it once she was alone in her car. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message sent a chill down her spine. "The Reynolds case isn't what it seems. If you want the truth, meet me tonight at Oak Ridge Park, 8 p.m. Come alone." Rebecca sat in her car, staring at the note. Oak Ridge Park at 8 p.m. It was already 6:30. Every bit of her judicial training screamed that this was inappropriate, possibly dangerous. Anonymous meetings about active cases went against everything she stood for professionally. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with Thomas's case. She had recused herself officially, but that didn't stop her from caring about the truth. After all, she was a judge because she believed in justice. By 7:45, Rebecca had changed into casual clothes and parked near the entrance to Oak Ridge Park. The evening air carried a slight chill as she walked along the path, alert to her surroundings. The park was mostly empty, with just a few joggers finishing their evening runs. At the center of the park stood an old gazebo, and as Rebecca approached, she saw a figure waiting inside. She slowed her pace, suddenly uncertain. Then the person turned, and Rebecca recognized Diane Kelly, Thomas's former assistant at Westland Construction. They had never formally met, but Rebecca had seen her name in the case files. "Judge Wilson?" Diane stepped forward, looking nervous. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I probably shouldn't be here, Rebecca admitted. But I want to understand what's happening. Diane glanced around before speaking. I've worked with Thomas for 6 years. He's a good man, honest to a fault. These charges against him, they're not right. What do you know about it? Rebecca asked carefully. I've seen things at Westland, strange financial movements, records being altered. It started about 3 years ago when Mr. Westland's son-in-law joined the company. Thomas noticed discrepancies in the accounts and started investigating quietly. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Are you saying Thomas discovered embezzlement? Diane nodded. The son-in-law, Richard Graves, was siphoning company funds through fake contracts. Thomas gathered evidence for months. Then suddenly, everything turned around. Thomas was accused, evidence appeared against him, and Richard led the investigation. Why wouldn't Thomas defend himself? Present what he found? Because of the daughter, Jenny Westland. She's a single mother with health problems. Thomas discovered that Richard had been manipulating her medical insurance, endangering her coverage. If Thomas exposed Richard, Jenny and her son would suffer the consequences. Diane's voice dropped. Mr. Westland is in his 70s. The shock of his son-in-law's betrayal, his daughter's situation, Thomas believed it could destroy the family. The pieces began falling into place. Thomas taking the blame to protect a family. It fit with what his mother had said, with the person Rebecca had once known. Do you have any of this evidence? Rebecca asked. Diane hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. Thomas kept backups. He never told me to use them, but I can't stand by and watch him go to prison. Rebecca stared at the drive but didn't take it. I've recused myself from the case. I can't be involved. I understand, Diane said, disappointment evident in her voice. But someone needs to make sure the truth comes out. As they talked, a jogger passed by the gazebo for the 3rd time. Rebecca noticed he wasn't actually jogging anymore, just watching them. Unease crept up her spine. We should go, she said quietly. I think someone's paying attention to us. Diane glanced over her shoulder and paled. That's David Barnes, Richard's security consultant. He's been following me for days. She pressed the flash drive into Rebecca's hand. Please, just keep it safe. Before Rebecca could respond, Diane hurried away, disappearing down a dark path. Rebecca clutched the drive, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. She had removed herself from Thomas's case professionally, but now found herself personally entangled in its truth. As she walked back to her car, Rebecca noticed the man who had been watching them speaking urgently into a phone. Whatever was happening, it was bigger and more dangerous than she had imagined. Rebecca drove home with her mind racing and the flash drive burning a hole in her pocket. Street lights flashed across her face as she checked her rearview mirror repeatedly, paranoia setting in after the encounter at the park. Was she being followed? Had she just crossed a line that could end her judicial career? Once home, she double-locked her doors and pulled the blinds. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the flash drive into her personal laptop, not her work computer. If these files contained what Diane claimed, viewing them put Rebecca in an impossible position. The drive contained dozens of meticulously organized folders. Financial records, email screenshots, and transaction logs, all carefully documented and annotated. Thomas had been thorough. Rebecca wasn't an accountant, but even she could see the pattern of fraudulent transactions leading back to Richard Graves. There were also recorded phone conversations between Richard and various contractors discussing kickback schemes. Most disturbing were the emails regarding Jenny Westland's health insurance. Richard had indeed been manipulating her coverage, removing certain benefits while telling her everything was still covered. Her son's ongoing medical treatments for a rare condition would have been jeopardized if the insurance changes had been discovered. "Oh, Thomas," Rebecca whispered. The evidence painted a clear picture. He had discovered corruption and faced an impossible choice: expose the truth and hurt innocent people, or shoulder the blame himself. After several hours reviewing the files, Rebecca rubbed her tired eyes. The right thing to do legally was clear: turn over the evidence to the current judge and prosecutor. But something held her back. Richard Graves had influence and resources. If he discovered evidence was being presented, what might he do to protect himself? Would Jenny and her son suffer consequences before justice could be served? Her phone rang, startling her. Unknown number. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Judge Wilson." The voice was male, unfamiliar. "I believe you received something tonight that doesn't belong to you." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "A concerned party. That drive contains company property. Return it to Westland Construction by tomorrow, and we'll consider this matter closed." "And if I don't?" The caller paused. "Judge Wilson, you've built an impressive career. It would be unfortunate to see it end over this misunderstanding." After the call ended, Rebecca sat frozen. They knew about the drive. They knew who she was. And now they were threatening her career. She needed help, but who could she trust? The police? The district attorney? Both worked closely with the courts, and word would get back to her colleagues immediately. She had already recused herself. Possessing evidence related to the case was a serious breach of judicial ethics. There was one person who might understand her predicament. Someone who knew both law and Thomas. Her former mentor, retired Judge Harold Brown, lived just outside the city. If anyone could advise her on navigating this dangerous territory between personal ethics and professional duty, it would be him. Rebecca copied the flash drive's contents to an encrypted folder, then grabbed her keys. As she slipped out to her car, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there earlier. Someone was watching her house. This was no longer just about Thomas. Her own safety was now at risk. Rebecca drove through the darkness, taking a winding route to Judge Brown's house to ensure she wasn't followed. Rain began to fall, drops streaking across her windshield like tears. The weather matched her turbulent emotions: fear, determination, and a lingering connection to Thomas that she couldn't ignore. Judge Harold Brown had been her mentor when she first became a lawyer. Now in his 70s, he had retired 5 years ago but remained sharp as ever. His modest home sat on 2 acres of land, far enough from neighbors to ensure privacy. When Rebecca pulled into his driveway just after midnight, the porch light flicked on. Harold appeared at the door in a robe and slippers, concern etched on his face. "Rebecca? What on earth brings you here at this hour?" "I'm sorry for the late visit," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I need your advice, and it couldn't wait until morning." Inside, seated in his cozy living room with a cup of tea warming her hands, Rebecca told him everything, recognizing Thomas in court, her recusal, the meeting with Diane, the flash drive, and the threatening phone call. Harold listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You've stepped into dangerous waters, Rebecca. Legally speaking, you should turn that evidence over to the authorities immediately. But what if Richard Graves has connections there too? What if the evidence disappears before it can help Thomas?" Harold sighed. "That's the personal side speaking, not the judge. You care about this man." "I care about justice," Rebecca insisted, though they both knew it wasn't the complete truth. "Let me see the evidence," Harold finally said. Rebecca pulled out her laptop and showed him the contents of the flash drive. Harold examined the files with the methodical attention he'd been known for on the bench. After nearly an hour, he closed the laptop. This is compelling evidence of fraud, he admitted. But using it presents significant challenges. You're compromised due to your personal connection and the fact that you received this outside proper channels. So what do I do? Harold thought for a moment. There's a federal prosecutor I trust, Claire Montgomery. She handles white-collar crime and is incorruptible. If this evidence came to her anonymously, she would investigate properly. Anonymously? Rebecca repeated. Yes. You can't be connected to this, Rebecca. Your career, maybe even your safety, depends on it. Just then, headlights swept across the windows as a car slowly drove past the house. Both of them tensed. You shouldn't stay here, Harold said quietly. They may have followed you after all. Where can I go? I have a cabin about 2 hours north. Few people know about it. He scribbled directions on a notepad. Go there and lie low. I'll contact Claire tomorrow and arrange for the evidence to reach her through channels that can't be traced back to you. As Rebecca prepared to leave, Harold placed a hand on her shoulder. Be careful. And Rebecca, if Thomas is innocent as this evidence suggests, you'll have helped him more by staying safe and ensuring justice works properly than by risking everything on a personal crusade. She nodded, knowing he was right but struggling with the feeling that she was abandoning Thomas again, 23 years later, in a different but equally painful way. The cabin stood silhouetted against the early morning sky, a simple wooden structure nestled among towering pine trees. Rebecca had arrived just before dawn, exhausted but too anxious to sleep. She made coffee in the rustic kitchen and sat by the window, watching as the forest came alive with the first light. Her phone had no signal here, both a blessing and a curse. No one could track her, but she also had no way of knowing what was happening back in the city. Was Thomas safe? Had Diane been confronted about the missing evidence? Was Harold able to contact Claire Montgomery? The isolation gave Rebecca time to think about how quickly her orderly life had unraveled. Just 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been preparing for a complex trial. Now she was hiding in a cabin, involved in exposing a conspiracy, all because of a man she had once loved. She found herself wondering what might have happened if they had stayed together all those years ago. Would Thomas be in this situation now? Would she have become a judge? Their paths had diverged for reasons that seemed so important at the time but now felt trivial compared to the current stakes. Around noon, Rebecca heard a vehicle approaching. Her heart raced as she peered through the curtains. Relief washed over her when she recognized Harold's old truck coming up the dirt road. Any problems getting here? He asked as she met him on the porch. No, I think I'm in the clear. What's happening in the city? Inside, Harold unpacked some groceries he'd brought and updated her. I got the evidence to Claire. She was very interested. Started making calls immediately. And Thomas? Still in county lockup. His preliminary hearing is tomorrow with Judge Patterson. Harold paused. There's something else. Diane Kelly was found unconscious in her apartment this morning. Rebecca gasped. Is she? She's alive. Accidental gas leak according to initial reports, but Claire doesn't believe it for a second. The implications were clear. Richard Graves was silencing potential witnesses. If he had tried to harm Diane, what might he do to Thomas? We need to move faster, Rebecca said urgently. Claire's already obtained warrants to seize Westland Construction's financial records and Richard Graves' personal accounts. But these things take time, Rebecca. Thomas doesn't have time. His hearing is tomorrow, and Graves clearly isn't above hurting people. Harold studied her face. What are you thinking? I need to talk to Thomas. That's impossible. You're recused from his case, and you're supposed to be hiding. There has to be a way. Rebecca paced the small living room. What about his attorney? Could you arrange a meeting? Harold frowned. His public defender? Possibly, but it's risky. We need to warn Thomas about what happened to Diane. And he needs to know that help is coming, that he doesn't have to keep protecting people at his own expense. After some discussion, Harold reluctantly agreed to contact Thomas's attorney and arrange a confidential meeting. He would use his connections as a retired judge to make it happen without raising suspicion. As Harold prepared to leave, Rebecca handed him a letter. If you can't arrange a meeting, please give him this. What does it say? Rebecca looked away. That he's not alone this time. That someone believes in him. Harold nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. I'll do what I can. Stay here, stay safe. I'll be back tomorrow with news. After he left, Rebecca stood on the porch watching the truck disappear among the trees, feeling both helpless and determined. The quiet of the forest surrounded her, but her mind was racing with the noise of unresolved feelings and uncertain dangers. The county detention center loomed gray and imposing in the afternoon sun. Rebecca sat in the back of Harold's truck, a baseball cap pulled low over her face and sunglasses hiding her eyes. They had agreed this was too risky, but when Harold returned to the cabin that morning with news that Thomas's preliminary hearing had been moved up unexpectedly, they knew time was running out. Remember the plan, Harold said quietly. 15 minutes. I'll create a distraction at the front desk while you slip in with the group of law students touring the facility. Lisa will meet you in the attorney conference room. Lisa Martinez was a former student of Harold's who now worked as a public defender. She had agreed to help after hearing a carefully edited version of the situation. Rebecca nodded, her heart pounding as she watched a group of 20-something students gathering at the entrance. When Harold gave the signal, she slipped from the truck and joined the back of the group, keeping her head down as they were led inside. The detention center smelled of disinfectant and despair. Rebecca had visited many times as a prosecutor, but never like this, never as someone breaking rules she had sworn to uphold. She followed the memorized directions, breaking away from the tour group at a corridor junction and quickly making her way to the attorney meeting rooms. Lisa was waiting, her expression tense. This is highly irregular, Judge Wilson. I know. Thank you for doing this. Thomas Reynolds will be brought in momentarily. You have exactly 10 minutes before the guard returns. When the door opened again, Thomas appeared in his orange jumpsuit, looking thinner than he had in court. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Rebecca. What are you doing here? He whispered as the guard closed the door. Trying to help you, Rebecca said, removing her sunglasses. Someone tried to hurt Diane. A gas leak at her apartment. Thomas paled. Is she? She's alive, but it's clear Richard Graves is desperate. Thomas, a federal prosecutor named Claire Montgomery, is investigating Westland construction based on the evidence you collected. But your hearing has been moved up. Graves is rushing the process. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. You shouldn't be involved in this, Rebecca. Your career. My career isn't worth someone's life, she interrupted. Why are you protecting these people at such cost to yourself? His eyes met hers, filled with the same quiet determination she remembered from their youth. Jenny Westland saved my life once. Did you know that? When I was at my lowest after college, after you and I. He paused. She got me the job at Westland when no one else would take a chance on me. Her son has a rare condition that requires specialized treatment. If Richard goes down and the company collapses, they lose everything. Rebecca leaned forward. But if you go to prison for a crime you didn't commit, you lose everything too. Some things are worth the sacrifice. The words hung between them, laden with meanings beyond the current situation. Rebecca realized he was the same person she had known, willing to put others before himself, even at terrible cost. There's another way, she said urgently. Claire is building a case that could bring down Richard without harming the company or Jenny. But you need to hold on, not plead guilty, delay as much as possible. A knock at the door signaled their time was almost up. Promise me you won't give up, Rebecca said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Not this time. Thomas looked down at their hands, then back to her face. You always did believe in me more than I believed in myself. The door opened, and Lisa appeared. Time's up. As Thomas was led away, he glanced back at Rebecca. In that brief exchange of looks, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that 23 years couldn't erase. The courthouse buzzed with unusual activity for a Thursday morning. Rebecca watched from across the street, disguised in a dark pantsuit and glasses instead of her typical judicial attire. Harold stood beside her, concern etched on his face. You shouldn't be here, he murmured. If anyone recognizes you. I need to see this through, she insisted. Thomas's preliminary hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. with Judge Patterson presiding. Claire Montgomery had worked through the night, but had she gathered enough evidence in time? Rebecca's phone vibrated with a text from Lisa, in position. Prosecution and defense ready. Through Harold's connections, they had learned that Richard Graves would be attending the hearing, unusual for the accuser in an embezzlement case. More concerning was the rumor that the district attorney himself had taken sudden interest in the case, pushing for an immediate resolution. They're rushing this because they know Claire is closing in, Harold said. As they watched, a black SUV pulled up to the courthouse steps. Richard Graves emerged, an imposing figure in an expensive suit. Rebecca had only seen him in photographs from the case file, but his arrogant demeanor matched everything she had heard. Behind him came Frank Westland, the elderly company owner, looking frail and confused. Jenny's not with them, Rebecca noted. I wonder if she knows what's happening. The answer came moments later when a young woman rushed up the steps, calling out to her father. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see her distress. Jenny Westland was thin, almost fragile, with a pallor that spoke of her health struggles. Dad! Wait! Jenny caught up to her father and Richard, grabbing Frank's arm. Why didn't you tell me about the hearing? Richard stepped between them. Jenny, you're supposed to be resting. This is just a formality. It's Thomas's future, she protested. Their voices faded as they entered the building. Rebecca looked at Harold. We need to get inside. The courtroom was packed, but they found seats in the back row. Rebecca kept her head down, painfully aware that many people here would recognize her. At the defense table, Thomas sat beside Lisa, his shoulders straight despite the circumstances. When Judge Patterson entered, the proceedings began quickly. The prosecution outlined their case, presenting selected financial records that painted Thomas as a calculating thief. Lisa objected repeatedly to the rushed nature of the proceedings and the selective evidence. Your Honor, she argued, the defense has just received notice of federal interest in this case. We request a continuance pending the outcome of that investigation. The prosecutor scoffed. Federal interest? We've received no official notification. This is a delay tactic, Your Honor. Judge Patterson looked skeptical. Ms. Martinez, do you have documentation of this federal interest? Lisa hesitated. Not at this time, Your Honor, but... Then we proceed, Patterson ruled. Rebecca felt her hopes sinking. Without Claire Montgomery physically present or official documentation of the federal investigation, the local court would continue its process. Thomas's chance at justice was slipping away. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. A woman in a sharp suit strode confidently down the aisle, followed by two agents in dark jackets. Your Honor, she announced in a commanding voice. Claire Montgomery, Assistant United States Attorney. I have a federal warrant to seize evidence related to ongoing financial crimes at Westland Construction. Richard Graves shot to his feet. This is outrageous. There's no basis. Mr. Graves, Claire interrupted coolly, I suggest you save your objections for your own hearing. Agents are currently executing search warrants at your home and office. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Through it all, Rebecca watched Thomas. For the first time since she'd seen him in her courtroom, a look of relief crossed his face. 6 months later, Rebecca sat in her chambers, reviewing case files for the afternoon session. Her life had regained its normal rhythm after the turbulence of the Westland construction case, though nothing was quite the same as before. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk poked his head in. Judge Wilson, someone's here to see you. Says it's important. Rebecca looked up, surprised to see Jenny Westland standing in her doorway. Thinner than before, but with color in her cheeks and a determined look in her eyes. Ms. Westland. Please, come in. Once they were alone, Jenny spoke softly. I wanted to thank you personally. I know what you did for Thomas, the risks you took. Rebecca remained professional. I'm not sure what you mean. Jenny smiled sadly. You don't have to pretend. Thomas told me everything after the case was dismissed. About your history together, about how you helped expose Richard's crimes. The federal investigation had moved swiftly once Claire Montgomery took over. Richard Graves now faced multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and insurance fraud. Frank Westland had stepped down as CEO, with the company now in reorganization. And Thomas, all charges against him had been dropped. How is your son? Rebecca asked. Better. Once the truth about Richard's manipulation of our health benefits came to light, the insurance company restored our proper coverage. The treatments are working. Jenny paused. Thomas was right to want to protect us, but wrong to think he had to sacrifice himself. Rebecca nodded, uncertain what else to say. He's starting his own financial consulting company, Jenny continued. Helping small businesses avoid the kind of fraud that nearly destroyed our family. She placed an envelope on Rebecca's desk. He asked me to give you this. He didn't want to complicate your professional life by coming himself. After Jenny left, Rebecca stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a simple note. Some things are worth waiting for. When the dust settles, when your career is secure again, when enough time has passed, perhaps we could start over with coffee? 23 years is too long to waste more time. Whatever you decide, thank you for believing in me. Always, Thomas. Rebecca folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Through her window, she could see the city stretching out before her, the same view she'd had for 5 years, yet somehow everything looked different. Second chances didn't come often in life. Sometimes, like in Thomas's case, justice prevailed against the odds. Sometimes, like in their case, the heart found its way back to where it belonged. Rebecca picked up her phone and began to type a message.